Geopolitics and Empire is joined by Vítězslav Kremlík, who hails from the Czech Republic. During studies of history at the university, he was fascinated by the way how climate change affected human history. It was usually the cold periods that caused the trouble. As a PhD student at Charles University, he studies sociology of post-normal science, the postmodern mix of science and politics. He's a frequent guest of Czech radio and television programs dealing with climate change. He was recently interviewed by Mark Morano on TNT Radio, my colleague there, Mark, and he lives in Prague. He's married. He's a father. He's the author of this book, A Guide to the Climate Apocalypse, which you must buy. Welcome, Vitislav.
Hello, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for taking the time. And, I'd like you to be on this episode, our guide through the climate apocalypse. And so you're going to kind of help take us through what's really going on regarding the climate narrative. And maybe we'll start. You say that the Earth's climate has always been changing, indeed, and you're very nuanced in your approach. And I believe you make the case that neither is it false that we are experiencing heightened climate activity or issues, but neither is it the end of the world as we know it, or man's fault. So, can you help us make sense of what's going on?
Well, I'm afraid the problem with this narrative is that the mainstream falsely claims that there are climate change deniers. Although I'm a climate change skeptic and I've spoken to many of like-minded people, I have never met any climate change denier. There are some people who deny or underestimate the greenhouse effect, but nobody ever has denied the existence of climate change. So this is at the very core of the debate. There is misinformation, but from the mainstream. When the activists say that climate change is coming, or that it's already occurring, and that it's real, these are pointless statements that nobody disputes and that mean nothing, because everybody knows that climate has been warming since the mid-19th century. You can see it in the Alps, where the glaciers have melted and have become much smaller. Nobody is disputing that. The dispute is about the future, about the apocalyptic predictions of doomsday coming. And the dispute is whether the current climate is unusual in historical context, whether it's unprecedented, and who has caused it, how much we have caused it, and how much it's a natural cycle. One of the things that are important from my point of view, that there are climate cycles that have been shaping history of mankind and nature over thousands and millions of years. My favorite cycle, one of the most important, is the bond events, which occur every, let's say, 1,500 years. And this is why global warming started in the 19th century, because such a cooling event, one of the bond events ended, this little ice age ended. So of course, when an event like that ends, there always is warming. And that was a natural event when it started. We can dispute how much we have made it bigger, but the basic dispute is not about what the mainstream claims.
A message from our sponsors. It seems we're headed for economic collapse, a dystopian social credit system, even another world war. As a longtime expat myself, I've secured multiple passports, getaway locations, foreign financial accounts, and escaped to the sunnier shores of Mexico. Mikhail Thorup of the Expat Money Show can help you do the same and become Great Reset proof. He's hosting the Expat Money Summit with 30-plus experts that'll help you reclaim your freedom in a time of upheaval and uncertainty by moving your life, business, and wealth offshore. Themes include securing your Plan B safe haven, offshore banking, decentralized finance, second passports, and much more. Protect yourself and secure a new life abroad. Register now for free at expatmoneysummit.com, or don't, and enjoy eating bug burgers in your smart city. If you do find yourself stuck in a smart city, the Nomos app will help you survive COVID-1984 and the Great Reset. Nomos is a time bank that can be used by communities anywhere in the world. You just need to talk people into using it. I've spoken to the developer who is passionate about creating solutions for surviving and thriving in the apocalypse. Nomos is available in English and Spanish, so hurry and visit nomos.net before they roll out the cashless society and put you in the algorithm ghetto. And don't forget to fund Geopolitics and Empire. You can leave a donation, except on Patreon or PayPal, which have banned us, book a consultation, or become a member.
Yeah, and you've mentioned as well, if it wasn't for past global warming, many places would not be inhabited, like my hometown, which is Chicago, or Canada, or Sweden, and so on. You've also said that I think we are now entering into one of the colder times in history. Again, some people call this the solar minimum, and as well. They talk about global cooling. So as you said, we're always warming and cooling and warming and cooling. It's just that now they're trying to, I think, use this as a pretext to take political control. But just on that note of cooling, are we now entering into a cooling period as well?
I am not as bold as to make predictions, because if we have learned anything from the climate change alarmism, always fail in this matter. In 1970s, the science didn't for a long time believe that the climate was really cooling. And when finally it became evident that there is a very large cooling event after World War II, there were 30 years of very significant cooling in the Northern Hemisphere after World War II. And at the very moment when the mainstream acknowledged that this was really happening in spite of greenhouse gases, at the very moment the warming period started. So we had some 30 years of warming. And when it became a warming panic in the 1990s, thanks to the IPCC, which was started to handle this global warming, at the very moment when it became a campaign, so the warming halted. It stopped for a whole generation. There was no statistically significant warming anywhere. So whenever you make these bold predictions, they always something else happens. So don't ask me for predictions. This is one of the most important things here, because the globalists, those people who want to do the global governments, they always make some scary predictions, and they use it as a pretext for promoting some more regulations. Like, we are going to scare you with some terrible doomsday prediction, and if you give us more power and money, we will protect you. So let's avoid bold predictions.
Yeah, and again, some other points you make in your book. And by the way, I love the way you made the book. It's very easy to read, and so I highly recommend it. And I recall learning about the medieval warm period, where 1,000 years ago it was warmer than it is today. You mentioned how temperature now is similar to that of previous centuries, like 16th and 17th century, and that mankind had experienced abrupt climate change at times when no industry existed. So it's like now, they're trying to blame us and our industry, when in the past there were greater changes without this industry. And as well, you talk about the impact of climate on migration, the economy, economic collapse, and civilizations. That climate has determined the fate of empires. I also got this book here, very thick, but it talks about war, climate, and catastrophe in the 17th century, basically along the same lines of what you were saying, how climate affects civilization. So could you talk a little bit about that?
This is, speaking of 17th century, okay, so today we are told that the climate that used to be here before 20th century was normal, and that if we deviate from that, we are moving away from normal into something that's weird and not normal. But it's totally crazy, because we have been emerging from Little Ice Age, and Little Ice Age, especially the 17th century, the Maunder Minimum, it was the coldest damn period since the time that the mammoth extinction occurred. It was the coldest time in 10,000 years. That really was extreme, like a real extreme period, very unusual in the context of 10,000 years. And now that this extreme has ended, we should be worried about it. It is really crazy. Even if we mention, again, the post-war cooling period, so people were worried in 1970s about the cooling because every change of climate brings some sort of extreme weather or bad weather. There is always some bad weather, okay? And people were worried about cooling at that time. So shouldn't we be relieved when this cooling ended and was replaced with warming? So the point is that the policymakers and even some politically charged scientists, they always look at the weather disasters, which always happen, no matter what, and they always blame it on something. In 1970s, during the cooling, so the drought periods, floods, and storms were blamed on cooling. And now exactly the same events are blamed on warming. So it's a little bit crazy. Like whatever happens is always caused by the thing that is now fashionable, you know. And you can see how even science and scientists are slaves to these fashions or political doctrines, and they do not exist far away from the madding crowd in some ivory towers. They are part of a society, and they are affected by all the superstitions that is floating around. It's just like, you know, in the 17th century, in 18th century, people like Isaac Newton believed in astrology because it was a fashion of the day. And now we have good scientists who believe in the doomsday thing because it's the fashion of the day. But we shouldn't do this because this doomsday feelings, this apocalyptic belief, it is detrimental to your well-being, to your mental health. Just if you look at the Swedish girl, Greta Thunberg, and people like her, I believe that many of them are true believers, okay? Some of them are just career-hungry hypocrites, of course, but I believe that there are people who are genuinely worried because they see something on the news and they believe the propaganda, and they really can grow up worrying about the future, because if you believe the apocalyptic narrative, so you have no future. By the way, this has been important negative feature of the whole green movement. I recall that even Sir Karl Popper, this sociologist, was who defined what a scientific method is. So he was an important figure in defining what science means. And he commented in 70s, long time ago, that his main complaint about the green movement is how pessimistic they are. And their slogan, even in 1970s, was no future. We have no future because of environmental problems. And we still have this feeling. And it's not good, it's pointless. And most of all, it is in contradiction with the facts. If you look at objective indicators like malnutrition, so the success is unbelievable. I can't believe when I hear the numbers. Malnutrition, the number of hungry people in the world, has been falling dramatically, even in the recent decades, even in the recent 30 years, the numbers are still going up, even though we have got more people than ever, now more than 7 billion people, right? But fewer and fewer people in absolute numbers as well as percentage live in hunger. We have fewer people than 100 years ago who die because of weather disasters. Over 90% less people die in weather disasters in spite of booming population. So we are living in a world which is safer than it used to be before global warming or before industrialization. This world has become better. And yet we have got this tremendous apocalyptic negativism. It's totally irrational.
And something, again, interesting in your book that I'm only now starting to learn about is how, as you say, these people are saying that we are causing all these problems, but you give examples from, I think Vikings in Greenland and the Mayan civilizations and other civilizations where, or in Egypt, where, it was cooling that came that caused droughts, that forced civilizations to collapse. or where basically the climate that's outside of our control changed, and that forced these civilizations to collapse. You mentioned the Roman Empire as well, being affected by the climate and the amount of food that could be grown, again, outside of our control. And then as well, what is driving that climate? I see it as the sun. People like Piers Corbyn, and I spoke to meteorologist Joe Bastardi not long ago, who both agree that it's basically like the solar cycle and things like that outside of our control, influencing all of this. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Well, I studied history, so I started to be interested in this matter because I was curious what causes these great events in history. Because if you look at the timing of various events, so some of them seem coming at sort of regular periods, coming back and back. And whether it's a coincidence or not, the timing looks pretty similar to the timing of these climate changes. I don't know, in the Stone Age, in the recent glacial period, all these great Stone Age cultures, they ended at the time of the great cooling events called Heinrich events. Nobody knows about it. Nobody writes about it. But this is in my eyes so important, as if climate change has been the pulse of history, destabilizing the civilizations and cultures and enforcing some change. So people need to adapt because the old systems are destroyed and new ideas get some opportunity to grow. So it seems like that to me. I don't know if there's enough time to mention that, but one of the people who noticed that without understanding the problem was the German philosopher Karl Jaspers in the 1930s or 40s. And he noticed that all the great religions of today were born around the 6th century before Christ. Just count with me, okay? Which world religions started around this century? Confucianism, Lao Tzu, Taoism, the Greek natural science, and the Jewish monotheism, all these great, and Buddhism, of course, all these great ideological systems that replaced polytheism started sort of in the same time across whole Euro-Asian continent. It's really weird. Why would these events be timed at the same time? They didn't have a lot of contact with each other. So Karl Jaspers didn't have, of course, any explanation. He just called this period Achsenzeit, the Axis period, and this has become a famous term in philosophy. They don't know any explanation. One of the explanations that's possible is that the timing coincides with great climate change event that preceded, and there was this cooling at the beginning of the Iron Age, at the time, similar to the times when the War of Troy happened and these migrations of sea people that attacked Egypt and so on. So it's one of the ways how to explain events that had similar timing across large space. So this is what I considered interesting. Naturally, we shouldn't try to explain everything in history by climate change only. That would be foolish. But I think it is probably one of quite significant influences. And now all what we have learned is somehow turned upside down. And what we hear from the news is the exact opposite of what we have learned. So now we should be afraid of warming, not cooling, and everything is sort of weird. So that when you watch the news, you can't believe your ears, what you hear. And it has become the new normal.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you then about these elites, which you write about in your book as well. You explain, they're pushing this green agenda, and they are racist and they are eugenicists. I've got some of their books. Paul Ehrlich, The Population Explosion. I got it for like 30 Mexican pesos at a used bookstore here, and of course, the Club of Rome. Right. And so you detail in your book how, you were giving an example of how they were kicking off an African tribe off their land that's been on that land for who knows how long because they made it into a nature reserve. And it's like you made the point. Well, it's like a good point. Like, well, those that tribe is a part of nature and biodiversity. Like they're separating, only animals and plants, but humans, as well. And what is the real agenda and the danger of these elites behind the climate change narrative and policies? I mean, you mentioned before global government. That for me is the biggest focus. I think they want to create a centralized global political structure to control the whole world. What's your take on what are their motivations?
Well, I think this is a natural development. Okay, you don't need any conspiracy theory about it. Like if you look at what companies do, so of course, unlike a century ago, now companies start their branches abroad. So they've got their subsidiaries in other countries and they build multinational chains. That's a natural development. But the political power also tries to do the same thing. They try to maximize their power, start their branches overseas, and they want to create some umbrella structure above nation states. And you've got structures like European Union and United Nations, which, of course, we started for a certain purpose. They had to serve certain specific purpose. But, when you create a bureaucratic organization like that, it will always take its own life. Like when you create some fictional character and it starts having life of its own and you lose control over what's doing. So the bureaucratic organization like that necessarily will start finding areas or excuses for boosting its power and budget. And naturally, climate change is a great issue, or the environmental things are a great thing because it is something that doesn't respect national borders. So you can claim, and we all know, we have all heard that global problems require a global solution. So naturally, that's a great excuse to take our power away from national parliaments and give it over to some international organizations.
Do you think the elites are succeeding or will succeed in their push for global domination or world government, or as they call it, global governance?
And I am no prophet. I can just tell you that whatever people think will happen, something else will always happen. Okay, so I don't think that they are omniscient, omnipotent people. Everything that's happening has been planned by them. What I believe instead is that they always use any crisis that happens as an excuse. There is a problem. We need more regulation. I don't think they created COVID crisis, but whenever something like that happens, they always come with the same suggestions. They are always the same answer to everything. You need to create some more international oversight committees. You need to create more rules, limit individual freedoms. It's always the same thing, whatever happens, never mind what it is. And again, it is logical. Like when you have powerful people, of course, they want to have more influence. Everybody wants to have more influence. So that is a logical event. And maybe that people, like the population, sooner or later will find some means to compete for power with the elites. Like I think it started with the businesses that created these international branches and multinationals, and the politicians didn't know what to do about it. How can you regulate something that is everywhere and nowhere? But then they started building international political structures that are now everywhere, and they are trying to dictate us what we should do about weather and energy and everything. The battle is not over, right? So I don't know what it will lead. And the people will have to find some way to organize themselves in some international police or to revive the power of nation states. I really don't have the answer. Definitely not. But I think we will be all surprised.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a bit about then energy, because you talk about it in the book. Do you think from your research that we have, because this has always been a question on my mind, and I talk to experts from different walks of life, and I still can't make up my mind. Do we have enough energy, oil, minerals, and resources for the foreseeable future? Because they're saying that we're running out of everything, and as you said, doomsday, it's the end of the world. But I'm kind of skeptical on that, you mentioned things like, we have coal for at least a century. And, what are your thoughts on the limits to growth or limits to energy in reality?
As far as the numbers we have now say, we have got enough fossil fuels for 1 or 2 or 3 centuries, depending on which fossil fuel you are referring to. And also, you've got nuclear power, and you can create a lot of energy from really, really tiny amount of uranium. So I believe that if nuclear power is perfected, if we learn how to use thorium and other elements, we could have nuclear power for 10,000 years, right? This is also, a few people know that whenever somebody is warning about peak something, like peak oil, he always refer to Mr. Hubert, who predicted peak oil in 50s. He predicted it would come some 20 years later. Everybody is quoting that, but hardly anybody mentions that in the same essay, in the same work, he proposed that we can handle that by substituting that with nuclear power. And the green people don't say that. They just want about peak oil without mentioning the logical next step in that. And that's sort of, we have been running out of fossil fuels since 1910, because always, every time you can say that you know only of some areas where the minerals are deposited, but you don't know about all of them that will ever in the future be discovered. You don't know what things will be discovered a century later, so that any predictions like that are always wrong. And this is basically what the Club of Rome's famous book, Limits to Growth, was about. They made silly predictions based on limited information, and they predicted that we would run out of oil by 1992, and so on. And the predictions, of course, were not fulfilled because of, they didn't know what would be discovered later. So this is the problem with any predictions. I think I also mentioned the funny story of the horse manure crisis from the late 19th century. I don't know if anybody has heard about it, but I discovered that in late 19th century, there was first international conference about urbanism, about the future of cities. And do you know what they were discussing that? They were worried that in the 20th century, and in the 21st century, they were worried that the cities would have tremendous problems with thousands and thousands of horses and horse manure. Because at their times, everything was, transport of goods, transport of passengers, everything except for a few trains, everything was powered by horses. And they were very about the future. They made their scientific extrapolations and predictions, and they were very puzzled and didn't know what to do about it. And they didn't expect that cars will replace horses. And that's a very important lesson, because the problems that we are trying to handle now in 50 years future it will play out completely differently than we think, because you don't know what will be invented 10 years later. And that's the memo. This is the problem with all these United Nations or European Union. They are trying to make 5-year plans like the Soviets, or 50-year plans, or 100-year plans, what the future of energy will be. It is such silly. It's just like some silly scene from Monty Python circus. You can't predict these things. A single invention can change everything in 10 years overnight. This is really silly. The point is that their solutions for climate change and energy that they are proposing right now to be done with present means, that they don't make any sense, that they don't work, they don't have the effect on the climate they would like to have, right? So this is pointless. And their predictions are pointless too. So
you talk about nuclear, you talk about Chernobyl, Fukushima, and how the threat is hyped. You give some numbers how very few people died or were affected by the Chernobyl disaster in the 80s. And I've also become a little bit dismissive of this hype because not long ago I lived in Semey, Kazakhstan, which is right next to the Polygon, the principal Soviet nuclear test site where they dropped over 500 nukes. In the surrounding areas, yes, there were no doubt people affected negatively with, genetic issues, cancers and things like that. But, I was surprised when I visited Ground Zero. The scientists who took me, like we didn't need any protection. We went in 1 hour, 2 hours, and it wasn't until we got just to a small area where the actual nuke dropped, we had to put on some protection and stay just for a few minutes. But outside of that immediate area, we didn't need any protection. And it seems like the scare around nuclear energy is hyped. What are your thoughts there?
Well, definitely you could theoretically have very destructive nuclear disasters somewhere. But what happened at Chernobyl, definitely people have very, very untrue ideas about. People's idea about the huge impact it had, these ideas as far as population impact, this idea is taken, or this impression is because of the huge number of people who were resettled. Because when the thing happened, so the authorities resettled, some 5 million people, like a huge territory was affected by the measures that were taken later. So the people had to go away. Huge area was, people had to leave, and these were really huge numbers. But it's not the number of people with affected health. The people who died at Chernobyl directly, those who went into the building to stop the leaks, and there were about 5 people who had to go to the very core of the problem, and they died quite soon, within months. But the rest of the people, about 200,000 people, they were affected by the rates to about, it was something about 1 year of attending a normal standard some radiation therapy if you go to the hospital, but relatively safe. And the only real that was clearly significant in the statistics is that a lot of children had problems with thyroid glands, but these problems were treatable. So almost nobody died, but they had to be treated for these problems. That is all. So it's not zero, but it's definitely is not apocalyptic landscape filled with terrible mutants as people tend to think. When you look at a Simpsons series, there is always this little fish with 3 eyes swimming in the pool of nuclear waste. So this is how people think that animals look around Chernobyl. They don't. So our ideas about what happened are mostly taken from some science fiction. It's mostly science fiction. It doesn't mean that nuclear power cannot backfire, but this is not what happened. And the hype has been detrimental to the green energy effort, because thanks to this hype, Western civilization has stopped building new power plants. So the nuclear energy output has been going down steadily for decades. So thanks to these green anti-nuclear policies, we have been having less and less clean zero carbon energy over decades. So if about 2 years ago, when we had this Extinction Rebellion people and this Greta Thunberg people and this Fridays for Future, and they were parading and some demonstrations, and they were shouting that the politicians failed us. You didn't defend our future. You didn't do enough. You are to blame that we do not have enough green zero carbon energy. It's not true. It was them. It was the green movement who caused that. The very same people who are marching in the streets with the banners. It's their own fault. It was their movement who undermined this green energy that we had really sort of zero carbon emissions. So this is all, most of the things that you hear in the news about it, everything is sort of upside down and a little bit different than what the mainstream is telling us.
And just on that movement, I was going to ask you, it seems to be there's a very religious tone or nature to climate change-ism. I mean, it's kind of, it's almost like a cult or a religion. Any thoughts on sort of the religious nature of this movement? Where now, on social media, sometimes you'll get posts taken down if you question climate changeism. You'll lose your job. There was a HSBC banker who recently questioned the hype of climate change, who lost his job. And any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is funny that even things like marches for science actually reflect religious thinking, not scientific thinking. Okay, if you say this is a march for science and thou shalt not question anything a science expert is going to say, but well, if you do that, you're not behaving in a scientific way. This is a religious way how to approach things. And yeah, definitely it does have religious overtones. And again, this shouldn't surprise us for several reasons. First of all, weather has always been a thing in religion. In the Aztecs, in old times, America, pre-colonial times, the Aztecs and other cultures over there, they made human sacrifice to gods of rain, and they believe that if you make human sacrifice, that you might ensure good weather. We are also being today, if you sacrifice something, we could make weather better, which of course doesn't work. It didn't work then, and it didn't work today, for reasons I can explain later. And this lack of tolerance, of course, is very religious. There was heretics and dogmas that shall not be questioned. That definitely is very religious approach. I mean, religion in the negative, sense of meaning, but also the very part about this apocalypticism. This very thing about this apocalypticism is very religious. Usually new religions, when you start small scale as a religious sect. So it's very, very frequent that they start with some very urgent message about impending doom that's coming within the lives of existing people. Actually, even when Jesus came, so there are some sentences in the New Testament that appears as if the people believed that the end of the world would come during their lives. So this is very frequent, this doomsday thinking. When you have Jehovah's Witnesses or the Adventists of the Seventh Day, they all started with making specific claims about the date when the doomsday will come. And we have got Greta Thunberg and the IPCC giving us deadlines. We are going to be done within 12 years or 2 years, things like that. Of course, it's very similar. And it comes from the same psychology. It's not a coincidence. This is what humans are used to think like. We have got thousands of years of tradition of this sort of thinking. So it's quite natural for the power elites to use this for their purposes. And there's nothing new. Actually, the more you think about it, the more boring it gets, because it does just this, the oldest trick in the book.
And speaking of the power elites, one of the things that kind of I'm worried about is where they want to take us with this green agenda. We see Europe committing economic suicide, as a result of the Ukraine war. They're shutting off nuclear power plants. Now, they're talking about people freezing in the future, the prices of energy going up. And it's like these elites want us all to live as middle-aged serfs in the neo-techno-feudal society of severe austerity and sort of living life permanently under war conditions and rationing. And something else that they've been talking about, there's that. And on the other hand, it seems like the COVID pandemic and climate are coming together. They're talking about climate lockdowns now. And my biggest fear is this digital kind of dystopia that they want to build based on this fear that you're talking about, this sort of carbon social credit system where we're all going to have these digital passports and you're going to be graded. And if you don't behave, they're going to shut off your privileges. Any thoughts on what they're trying to do here?
It looks like the way where it's heading, unfortunately. I don't know what will happen with that. I'm afraid that usually it's not the ordinary people who revolt. Ordinary people are not very revolutionary in most societies. This is why the feudal system lasted such long time. There were no significant uprisings anywhere. I think that these systems collapse only when the ambitious members of the middle class become sort of, annoyed with how the system constrains them. So when this austerity starts hitting and the lack of freedom starts being unpleasant to this lower strata of the ruling class, then we might have a chance that somebody will fight for us up there. Because let's face it, national governments are not able to, resist these globalist policies at all. And if they do, they are soon replaced by someone who is compliant. So, of course, I don't have any miraculous recipes for what to do about it. So we'll see what happens. But the thing is that some features about the COVID policies were really creepy. Like when you saw 10 million people locked in Shanghai who cannot leave their homes because of some COVID restrictions. And you see these robot dogs barking at people in empty streets that they shall not enter the streets and they shall be, they shall remain at home. It is like just from some Black Mirror science fiction series in future. I can't believe I'm no longer certain that I'm awake, or if I'm dreaming, I am no longer certain. It is so dreamlike, a lot of that, Or when you have these COVID passes, when you couldn't enter a restaurant if you were not vaccinated, like what the hell? Like even vaccinated people can spread disease. It's just like with any contagious disease, there can be people who do not fall ill, but they can spread the disease. It's just true with anything, anywhere. So it didn't make any sense. It is as if someone was testing how much we can stomach if we accept discrimination of some disobedient individuals. It very much looks like the Chinese social credit system, very much, So unfortunately, China is the economic tiger of these decades, and it is always the habit that the world is imitating those who appear economically powerful and self-confident. In the past, everybody was imitating Europe or Germany or America. Now, everybody's imitating China because it's powerful economically, and so even their totalitarian policies appear sexy. So we may end up having something like that here. And of course, it will be promoted with some very noble excuses that I'm sure it will be sugar-coated with some nice speeches about our safety, how our rulers are worried about safety or something like that. And it will be all very nice and peachy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in your book, you said conservatives do not want to acknowledge the existence of environmental problems, as this could be an excuse to restrict trade and personal freedom. At times, I've been guilty of this. If we set aside the problem of these tyrannical, homicidal, Malthusian elites, for a second that we've been discussing, what would you say are some of the true environmental issues or problems?
Well, typical, what I consider to be the true environmentalism is when you have toxic pollution, which is poisoning rivers and killing animals. That, in my eyes, is this true environmentalism. That's something that we should protect ourselves from. I got a little story about the Russian director, Andrei Tarkovsky, very influential art director, who died because he wasn't aware of environmental problems when he was shooting his famous film Stalker. So he was shooting this post-apocalyptic science fiction film in some areas of Russia or Ukraine where there were some environmental problems. He wanted some terribly looking areas. So he went there without protection. And they didn't know, the crew who shot the film, they didn't know that the water they were walking in was poisoned with some pollution. They didn't know there was some radiation in that area. So a lot of them died later because of this film. This is what true environmentalism looks like. You need to protect people from pollution like that. Aside of this, which is quite clear, is that naturally we have got fewer space for animals. So of course they are pushed away from cities. You have got fewer of them, and you need to, if you want to keep some diversity in our countries, so you should protect some of these species from extinction. Another great problem, I think, is overfishing in the oceans, because it's sort of public domain where anybody can go and catch something. So nobody's responsible for anything anywhere. So this overfishing is the real thing. And this is why now a lot of fish, sea fish that you actually eat, is not caught in open sea. This is actually grown in some farms at the seacoast, because otherwise we wouldn't have any left. So there are some real problems, definitely. And if it wasn't so covered with this ideology that people have become sick of, so we would see that there are some real technical problems of management. Like if you have a farm, you need to look after your resources. You shouldn't kill all your cows this season, because then you wouldn't have any left the next season. And I wouldn't even call it environmentalism. This, is why give it a special term? You
Common
just
sense.
need some good management of your resources, right? Why give it a special term? Why blend it? Why give it a color? Why say it's green or pink? It's not. It's just normal, rational management of your resources. But it is just like with communism. Like you had some legitimate concerns, but then they become politicized. It becomes a dogma, and then people get sick of it, and they throw everything out of the window. And it's very difficult, because we are humans. We cannot get some middle ground. We always run from one extreme to another. And, just like today, we live in the times of this social bubbles on social media, and nobody talks to the others. And I don't know where this will lead to. But yes, there are real environmental concerns, but definitely these real concerns have been somewhat overshadowed by climate issue. If you look at the website of Greenpeace or other movements, so 70% of that is carbon. You should buy carbon-friendly products. So it looks more like some marketing campaign of some green companies. And these real problems are sort of set aside because they do not have a real political support. Nobody will subsidize this very much. It's not sexy these days. So it has been replaced with this unified political support for decarbonization. And the things that we used to consider as true environmentalism have been sort of set aside. And that is not good, definitely. Even in the climate change issue, the realistic solutions that would help mitigate the immediate impacts of warmer climate, they are ignored. I'll give you an example, right? In Prague, there have been, when there were some heat waves in summer, so some policymakers started talking, we need to make streets greener. If there are trees, there is shade, it's nicer. The urban heat island effect, it's smaller, it will be great. Let's make more trees there. And people need to have air conditioning in public spaces like hospitals and bus stations and trams, so that they do not suffocate from heat when there is hot summer. And it's not happening then. When the heat wave goes away, people don't remember about these things. Nobody does any of these things, even though they would have immediate effect, very visible, the very next summer. And instead, they keep yapping about the need to lower carbon emissions a century later with tiny invisible impact anywhere. So this symbolic hunt for carbon business is more important to them than easy, tangible, and doable things that you could do right now. So it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, going back to animals, we should protect our animals, because I would still like to keep eating real hamburgers and not Klaus Schwab's insect protein bug burgers. Is there any other issue? I mean, your book goes through a host of issues. Is there anything else that you thought is important to raise or bring up?
As far as animals are concerned, well, of course, what seems to be a bit ridiculous when you speak about beef. So, of course, there are these ridiculous policies to lower greenhouse emissions from livestock, which means that cows shouldn't burp and fart so much. And they are investing money into research how to change the composition of fodder of these animals. What is the point? It is contradictory, because on one hand, we are told that fossil fuels, like human emissions, are worse than natural emissions of carbon because it is something added extra to the system from underground. Okay, our emissions are extra over the natural cycle of carbon. And now suddenly it doesn't matter. Now suddenly we are going to fight against the natural cycle, because the cow doesn't eat coal. Cows doesn't drink oil, as far as I have seen so far. I may be wrong. They eat grass. It's natural. It's totally bio-organic. It's nature, and it's a cycle. When the cow eats the grass, it will emit these gases. They will decompose in the atmosphere within a few years, and the resulting carbon and oxygen and hydrogen will be reintegrated into new grass. So it's a new cycle. Nothing new is added to the system. So why the hell should we combat it? It doesn't make sense, with one exception. Another excuse for making business. That's all. But many of the weird things can be explained if you just look at the human factor of the people who are doing it. But it doesn't really make sense. And
speaking of combat, how do we fight back against? How do we?
If I can interrupt you, because you reminded me of the natives in Africa, who are evicted from their ancestral land because they are not green enough. This is the same absurdity. So animals do not belong into nature, according to environmentalists. Also, the people from the Khoisan people from Kalahari Desert do not belong to nature, according to the environmentalists, because we, the white people of Europe, are coming to Africa to teach the natives how to treat nature, and if they don't obey us, they will be evicted from the nature in which they have been living for thousands of years. It's the same crazy logic.
How do we combat this crazy climate changeism, this climate cult? How do we fight back against this narrative?
I love these questions. Please tell us the final answer to the ultimate question of life, space, and universe and everything in one sentence. I really don't know. I'm afraid humans are not as smart as they think. Myself, it's silly as just as the other animals. So if you cannot just think that rationality will prevail. But the good thing is that these policies that do not work, they undermine themselves over time. You do not need to undermine them. And you, as a normal average Joe, cannot undermine them. You just can't, you just have to wait till they kill themselves with their stupidity. Because, some of the things are smart, how they can grab power and money, but they cannot govern. They cannot bring working solutions. Just like with communism, it undermined itself because it didn't work. They didn't understand how society works, and these people do not understand how nature works, and it is undermining itself right now in front of our eyes. One example is Germany, who was very ambitious with the green energies, and at the same time, they switch off their nuclear power, leaving themselves in the dark. How silly is that? It will necessarily affect them as well as whole Europe, by the way, making us vulnerable to imports from Russia and other countries, instead of looking for developing our old fossil fuel fields somewhere in the north, in the Arctic. By the way, a little bit changing the subject, I'm sorry for that, but few people know that fossil fuel companies started to be involved in the climate change debate in the 1970s, and they were not on the side of climate deniers. They were sponsoring the official government climate change research in the 1970s. They sponsored the key, like the Climate Change Institute in the University of East Anglia, where later ClimateGate started. They were founding it with their money because they wondered if warming perhaps might become oil fields accessible in the Arctic when it melts. So you could access the natural resource for mining there. It was their motivation why they started to be interested in this matter. So it's not true that they started as climate change deniers worried about their profits. Exact opposite is true, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fascinating. Do you have any final thought for us, or just get the book, A Guide to the Climate Apocalypse?
Yeah, it's like I would like people to read the book to make them sleep better. So if you're wondering whether apocalypse is coming or whether you could just calm down, so you should read it in the interest of your mental health and calm down and see that maybe the world is not as bleak as you might think, judging from the news. And if the book makes you sleep better, I will be more than happy.
Yeah, I feel more relaxed as well after reading the book. And I saw you are a fan of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and I think that's where you got a bit of your title, A Guide to the...
Yeah, sort of.
Yeah. Well, it's been great chatting with you again. I urge everyone. I actually got the digital book because I didn't think this book the physical would arrive in time. So I bought your book twice. But again, I urge everyone to go out and check out the book. And thank you for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
Thanks very much for the invitation. It has been a very pleasant talk.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list that goes out with each podcast and every weekend with a collection of news headlines. The newsletter and website are our last lines of defense. We're being censored and deplatformed. It's nearly impossible to find Geopolitics and Empire on the Google search engine. We've been blacklisted. YouTube frequently takes down our videos with strikes. Facebook restricts our page. Reddit and Twitter take down posts. And after the Associated Press mentioned Geopolitics and Empire in a 2021 article co-written with NATO, our Patreon account was terminated. Vimeo also terminated our Pro account. The best free way to help Geopolitics and Empire is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or elsewhere and subscribe to all of our media channels. You can find the video broadcast now on 5 platforms: Odyssey, Rockfin, Rumble, BitChute, and Brighteon. You can find the audio broadcast on the podcast ecosystem, SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, and so on. My current favorite social media channels are Twitter and Telegram, but you can also find us on Gab, MeWe, Minds, Float, VK, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Finally, Geopolitics and Empire is in dire need of funding to continue. You can leave a donation, purchase a consultation with the host, or become a member to receive additional benefits. We also produce a weekly broadcast called Dissident Thinker for members and Rockfin subscribers only. We will continue to fight the good fight come hell or high water. Thank you for listening.